like to see if I could get an officer to do a welfare check on my mother. No one we know of has heard from her in quite some time.
It just drew a lot of alarm bells for everybody.
The next steps to take is to obtain that surveillance footage.
It is suspicious. What are they doing with this money?
I was almost in disbelief. It was hard for me to realize that somebody could do this to another human being.
It felt like I couldn't breathe.
Let's start from top. Did you kill her?
"71-year-old Cindy Mudd is exchanging presents with her family at Christmas.
Thank you, Haley.
She gave the biggest bear hugs that you could possibly imagine. She was the perfect grandma in my eyes. I feel like she was made to be a grandma. When we did celebrate Christmas, it was a wonderful day. Nan was a virologist. She loved what she did, and she was pretty miraculous. I loved her for it. My mother was a single mother, and she worked really, really hard to provide for me. And she did a great job.
Dusty, good.
Cindy's loyal dog, Dusty, isn't left out.
Dogs were always part of her life,
Dusty.
but she was a dog lover. I can guarantee that dog was at her side at all times, just like every other pet we've ever had.
Oh, look what we got here. Look at that. That's
Dan started to show signs of dementia and early Alzheimer's. The last half a dozen times that I saw my mom, each time I saw her, there was a definite decline in her mental status. But my mom was funny and strong and kind. You just never think that something like this is going to happen to your family.
Metro Communications. My name is Jessica Bean, and I'd like to see if I could get an officer to do a welfare check on my mother.
On August 18th, we received a call from an individual who was concerned about Cynthia Mudd, who lived in our Cross Lanes area of Kanawha County.
I've been coming by the house every day for like the last week, and no one's answering. No one we know of has heard from her in quite some time.
I had started going down there every day and just pounding on the door.
The only contact we've had has been with this house guest, and he said, oh, she went away on vacation. My mother doesn't have the means to take a vacation. She doesn't have a car. She doesn't have the money. We don't know what's going on. No one's answering.
Is the house guest still there?
The house guest isn't answering the door if he is.
If they haven't been in contact, it could indicate that there's a very serious problem, and we need to find out as quickly as possible the condition of the individual.
All right, Jessica, I'll get somebody over there to check on her.
Dispatch sends Corporal A.J. Miller to Cindy's house.
So I noticed that the house was in really good shape. The yard was mowed.
Sheriff's office.
I knocked on the residence for over 15 minutes trying to make contact. I could hear a dog barking inside the home. Unless we see somebody that is in need of our assistance, can't open doors that we're not invited inside of. We generally try and look in the windows to make sure that somebody hasn't fallen, but they all had curtains and blinds on them, so I was unable to see inside the residence. I hit the siren to try and get her attention. Still no contact.
Cindy's daughter, Jessica, arrives at her mother's home to speak with Corporal Miller.
I remember meeting Jessica. She could tell me the specifics of her mother's living arrangement with a man that she's had living there.
So who was the person that was living with your mom?
His name is Sam May.
She wanted a partner. She wanted a soulmate. She wanted someone to be with her, like a companion. But my mother's relationship with Sam May felt like something that you would see on Jerry Springer. Sam and my mother were a couple, but he had gotten another female pregnant, Michelle, and moved her into the house. And my mom was taking care of Sam and his girlfriend.
Michelle had resided in the home up until about a year ago.
Do you have Sam's cell number?
I tried calling it over and over this week. It rang once, then nothing.
His telephone was out of service, so you couldn't leave a message. Any missing person complaint, it's imperative to canvass the area to find out when somebody had last seen Mrs. Mudd. The sooner we get that information, the better.
Deputies speak with Cindy's neighbors.
We had run into her neighbor, Lorna.
Excuse me, ma'am. I'm with the sheriff's office. Do you know your neighbor, Cindy Mudd?
Yes, but I've not seen her, not for a while.
It had been at least 3 weeks since she had seen her. Lorna made mention that she had recognized a younger female enter through a window of the residence. When we hear about somebody going through a window, it does create suspicion.
Lorna says the woman she saw enter the house is Sam's ex-girlfriend, Michelle.
They definitely need to be questioned by law enforcement in regard to why they're doing it, what's going on. It's imperative that we make contact with anybody that has had firsthand knowledge of her whereabouts, especially somebody that resides with her.
Who else has been living there?
2 guys, Sam and Arnold.
Who is Arnold?
Sam and Arnold were very good friends. Arnold would be just as important to speak to because if anything had happened, he may very well have either heard or seen something that would be beneficial to our investigation.
Lorna had explained that Arnold worked at a gas station about 1.5 miles from her home. I made contact with the manager of the gas station.
Excuse me, ma'am. I'm with the sheriff's office. I'm looking for one of your employees, Arnold Hiller.
I was advised that he was let go.
You got his cell number?
Arnold's telephone was out of service, so you couldn't leave a message. It's kind of a roadblock.
Kanawha County Sheriff's Office opens a missing persons investigation to find Cindy Mudd. Detective Elford leads the team.
Once all efforts are exhausted in locating her, we put her into NCIC as a missing person. You just got to go to your next piece of key evidence to hopefully locate her.
Investigators access Cindy's bank records to look for clues that might explain her disappearance.
We got Cindy's banking transactions. Come and have a look.
In looking at the transaction history, I noticed that there had been some ATM withdrawals and a lot of activity on July 20th, 21st, 22nd, and July 26th from a Speedway gas station, which is in very close proximity to Cynthia's residence.
That's a total of $832.94. That's a lot of money.
Those 4 transactions, they were back to back. And from looking at her banking history, it's something out of the ordinary.
Let's check it out.
Going down to that gas station, we want to obtain that surveillance footage.
Show me the footage from the camera on the ATM.
We viewed the footage on July 26th, right at the time of the exact transaction. Our hopes is to see who exactly is using that debit card.
Who's that?
I immediately recognized that person using Cindy's card as Samuel May.
I don't see Cindy. Show me the exterior camera.
We may be looking for Cindy as well, see if she may be waiting for him out in the parking lot. but we see nobody on the footage other than him.
Cynthia had some health issues, so it sounded as if he had become like a caretaker for Cynthia. It wouldn't be unusual for Sam to have Cynthia's card to buy groceries or other necessities for Cynthia.
Cindy's card was used at the same ATM 3 more times.
Let's watch the footage from the dates of the other transactions.
On July 20th and July 21st, I saw that it was Samuel May again, and he arrived at the store on foot. He made the cash withdrawal.
He withdraws $403.50 on both of those days. It was very suspicious.
And he headed back in the same direction of Cynthia Mudd's residence.
No, Cindy.
Can you play the footage from July 22nd?
What was interesting about July 22nd was not only was Samuel May the one that used the card at the ATM, but he was also accompanied by another white male. He's wearing a ball cap, shorts, and a maroon-colored t-shirt. It was clear that the two men were together. They were communicating. They purchased some snacks together. The male that's with Sam on the surveillance video, he had eyeglasses, is noticeably shorter and stockier. He's got facial hair. That man with Sam was Arnold Hiller, the friend of Samuel's who lived in the home with them.
Show me the outside camera.
They exit the store together, and then they walk back into the direction of Cindy's house.
Seeing that Sam and Arnold had consistently withdrawn money, it is suspicious. What need did they have for this immediate cash in such large amounts? What are they doing with this money?
They're just getting out as much money as the ATM will allow them. The last time Sam and Arnold were seen were just a few days prior. So in our minds, we have to locate them as quick as possible.
Thank you. We're going to need a copy of the footage here. All right, thanks.
Cindy's daughter, Jessica, calls Detective Alford with information she learned from Sam's ex, Michelle.
Detective Alford speaking. Hi, Jessica. How can I help you?
I learned from Jessica that her and Michelle had been in contact with each other.
She said that the last time she saw my mother, Cindy, was a month ago. Michelle said she broke into the house, she climbed in through a window, and she said no one's there, so she thinks that he has fled.
Jessica had given her permission to do that to see if she could maybe locate Cindy.
She told me that she had gone to the house because she hadn't heard anything from my mom, and she too was concerned for my mother.
It was Michelle who neighbor Lorna saw climb through Cindy's window. Investigators charge her with no crimes for entering Cindy's home.
It was obviously very important that we find and speak to Michelle. We met Michelle outside of her place of employment. We interviewed her just in our vehicle outside of the Dollar Tree. We asked Michelle about going over to Cynthia's house. She'd been unable to reach Samuel or Arnold by phone, and so she decided to go over to check on them all.
I actually let myself into the house, and I actually went through the window. I expected to find Sam passed out in bed. I was quite shocked to find the house empty. In Cindy's room, there's pillows missing off of her bed, which is weird because she likes pillows.
If she didn't see any signs of a disturbance, what happened to Cynthia? So what's your gut telling you?
My gut's telling me that something bad happened to Cindy.
Michelle reveals that she broke up with Sam a week earlier.
He's been a little agitated. He's been distant, major mood swings. He'll be okay one minute, and the next minute he's angry at everyone. Drunk, he's capable of anything.
If Sam wasn't at Salted Drive, do you have any idea where you'd be at?
I don't, honestly.
Michelle explained that because she shares a child with Samuel. She and Samuel have a tracking app called Life 360. This was very exciting because that could obviously give us GPS locations.
And that just basically shows when it went off in his last location, or?
Yeah, it shows the last time that he was out of the house. That was Tuesday night, and then he went home. Wednesday morning is when Sam turned his phone off. Okay. So that was the last time I know of him being at that location. It's still off. It still says off since 9:44 Wednesday.
Sam turns his tracking app off on August 17th. That's 2 days before Cindy was reported missing. It raises a red flag. Why would he stop sharing his location? 2 days, that's a lot of time. And with the amount of money they were retrieving from the ATM, I'm sure they could pay someone or maybe take a bus and get out of state. So we have to locate them as quick as possible.
Back at the sheriff's office, investigators reanalyze Cindy's banking activity.
At this point in the investigation, the transaction history using Cynthia's card was the only way we had of tracking anybody.
There's new transactions on Cindy's card 2 days ago.
We found a transaction on August 17th, the day Sam's Life 360 was turned off. And that was at the Family Dollar in the amount of approximately $71. We had seen who was using the card in July, but we wanted some video surveillance that would show us who in particular is using it in August.
Can we see the footage from August 17th?
We learned that the Family Dollar does have surveillance cameras, and they provided footage of the transaction from August 17th.
Yeah, play from there.
From the camera that's facing the doors, I'm hoping to see who's using Cynthia Mudd's card.
Stop there.
At 6:07 p.m., exiting the store, we see two white males, one in a camouflage hat and a blue shirt with a gray backpack, and we see another male in a white sleeveless shirt and khaki shorts.
That's Sam and Arnold.
It was a confidence booster and let us know we're moving in the right direction.
Rewind.
We're hoping to see what they're purchasing and also when they're checking out as well.
The two don't seem like they're in hiding. They don't appear nervous. They are chatty. They're just kind of joking back and forth.
They shop around for a little while and they pay with Cindy's card. It's a big moment for us as investigators because we see them still continuing spending Cindy's money and she's still a missing person.
Across town, Cindy's family grow increasingly concerned about her whereabouts.
Hi, Detective Alford? And you heard anything yet?
And the police were keeping me informed and making themselves available to me.
Thank you. Please let me know.
Nothing yet.
At one point, it felt like a nightmare. And I was just hoping that I was wrong and that I'd been worrying for nothing. My fears were pretty dark at that point, but I was hoping that maybe she was just sick.
On the following day, after we did the welfare check, a neighbor contacted the sheriff's office about Cynthia's dog.
911, where's your emergency?
Well, I don't know if anything's going on or not, but this lady across the road, she's an elderly lady, has a dog. Well, it's been out for days, and it's been over my porch eating cat food.
The neighbor thought that was very unusual. She also went with the dog back over to the residence.
I went to the door to knock on the door to check on the lady, and nobody answered. I followed the dog because it went around back, and he keeps sniffing at this big old pile of brush and stuff, and he just keeps sniffing and whining.
The dog kept going to this location in the backyard, pawing at the ground. It just drew a lot of alarm bells for everybody. Deputies went and responded to that call.
So I pulled up to the house. I then went over and spoke with the neighbor, Tanya, who was the complainant for this 911 call. I asked her to show me specifically the area of the yard that she was uncomfortable with.
Hi, boy. I'm gonna go have a look.
The dog came with me. He shadowed me over that location. Along the back fence, directly behind the house, there was what looked to be a partially covered pile of wood. I'm a canine handler. I pay a lot of attention to the dog, to how the dog is interacting with the environment. As soon as I got close to that wood pile, the dog laid down on his stomach, looked directly at the side of it, and he whimpered. His behavior completely changed.
See something?
I realized that what was meant to look like a wood pile was actually a stack of other stuff. I peeled part of like a outdoor backyard pool, and I saw what I thought was the side of a chest-style freezer. It was then that it became completely obvious that I was looking at a form of camouflage. There were several screws holding the freezer door shut. That immediately set off some red flags for me. I believed that there was something in the freezer that we needed to get to.
Corporal Ratliff calls for backup.
I receive a call to go to Salt and Drive. So I stop what I'm doing and I drive there. When I walk into the backyard, it definitely appeared like someone wanted to conceal this deep freezer from people seeing it. I think that that dog was letting us know that something was wrong with that area right there. We attempt to open it. We actually use pry bars to get the screws out of the way.
There was a strong odor. I have only ever been able to associate it with death.
We locate this roll of green carpet. We lifted the carpet out of the deep freezer, and it's got nylon rope around it, like somebody had tied the carpet to make it stay together.
Carefully, they started to peel it open little by little.
We're able to see human bones coming out of that carpet and a human skull.
Based on the state of decomposition, this body has obviously been in the freezer much longer than a day.
We believe that the body in the deep freezer is Cynthia Mudd. I was almost like in disbelief, you know. It was hard for me to realize that somebody could do this to another human being.
The medical examiner's office was able to determine that it in fact was Cynthia Mudd.
The autopsy revealed that Cynthia had a fractured rib and a fractured sternum. That information told me that either Cynthia had a very severe accident, whether that be a fall or someone else has caused those injuries.
Due to her being decayed so much, they estimated that she was deceased for at least a month.
investigators informed Jessica of her mother's death.
My husband and I were on the front porch. The officer started walking up the steps, and I said it before she could say anything at all.
No, Mom.
I said, she's dead. And she was. They didn't tell me exactly how she died. They just told me that they found out that Nan was dead. It felt like I couldn't breathe. I kind of wished it was wrong, and that something so heinous could never happen to someone so special to me.
Investigators secure a warrant to search the home Cindy shared with Sam and Arnold.
We're able to enter the house and start doing an investigation and collecting evidence and possibly see if the crime happened inside the house. When I'm walking through the residence, I'm looking for blood stains, places that, she could have been injured, weapons, anything to tie what happened to her in the deep freezer in that house. We noticed that there was a hole in the wall, which could have been made from physical force or maybe a blunt object. But there was nothing jumping out at us saying that a crime happened inside the house. As we made our way out to the garage area, we located the white nylon rope.
That rope seemed similar to the white rope that was used to wrap around the carpet that was surrounding the body in the freezer.
Whoever did this to Cindy has access to the home and the garage area.
We're really confident that Sam and Arnold most likely had some involvement in her death. Finding Sam and Arnold is very crucial.
Detectives analyzed the latest transactions on Cindy's debit card to try to pinpoint their location.
On August 17th, there was another transaction in Charleston, West Virginia, an ATM withdrawal for $400 cash. That's quite a large amount, and it prompts us to wonder, is the money being used to, pay to stay somewhere? It shifted our focus to at least the Charleston area.
I see Cindy's card was attempted to be used at a motel. It's a Quality Inn. My mind goes to, they gotta have somewhere to lay their heads. My adrenaline's pumping because I want to talk to these guys. I want to figure out what happened to Cindy.
Detectives head to the Quality Inn motel.
We're from the Kanawha County Sheriff's Office. You seen these two men?
We showed that clerk some photos, and they remember those two guys, Sam and Arnold.
When'd they check in?
It was confirmed that Samuel May and Arnold Hiller checked in to the motel on August 17th. It's the day before Cynthia Mudd was reported missing.
And that was the day that Sam had turned his location off with Michelle. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that they're hiding.
Are they still staying here?
We learned that Sam and Arnold had checked out of the motel on August 22nd. And this date was interesting because the media had just released that Cynthia's body had been recovered. Sam and Arnold probably got the feeling that the cards were getting ready to fall. They realized they needed to make a move.
It was kind of defeating a little bit, but we had another great piece of evidence. We had the surveillance footage from the hotel.
Okay, play it from there.
The lobby camera provided footage that showed Sam and Arnold checking into that motel on August 17th at 4:29 p.m.
And it appears that Arnold gives his ID for the room and that Sam pays for the room.
In the lobby, their behavior is somewhat unbelievable because something very bad has happened to Cindy. And here's the two people closest to her that probably know what's happened. Yet here they are being seen just kind of casually joking, nonchalant in a motel lobby.
Can you place the footage from the camera in their hallway?
We got really lucky on that particular camera placement. We got really good views of Sam and Arnold.
They appear to leave the room August 22nd at 9:33 a.m. Sam exits the room wearing a backpack, and shortly after Arnold exits the room, he also has his backpack with him. They walk out of the hotel at that point. Seeing that surveillance footage from the hotel, it's unable to really help us on where they were going. I don't know what happened to them at this point. It's very urgent to locate these two now because obviously they know law enforcement is actively looking for them, what's, going through their heads.
Detective Alford speaking.
So on the morning of August 23rd, I received a phone call that Charleston Police Department has Samuel May. We learned he had actually jumped in the river on the 22nd. I don't know if he was just using the river to try to maybe float and travel as far as he could to the next city, but some people had saw him, called 911, so he was in the hospital overnight. That moment I got that phone call about Samuel May, I'm excited. I want to be in the interview room with him.
Investigators bring Samuel May back to the sheriff's office for questioning.
We're just here to figure out what happened. You saw the news, you said, so obviously that's what we want to talk to you about. So just start at the beginning.
And I'm not one to lie.
And Detective Morgan had just come out and just flat out asked him.
Let's start from top. Sam, did you kill her? Did you kill her?
Who? Tom? Cindy?
Yeah.
I did.
When he heard that, we were kind of taken aback from it. Like, wow, like he's ready to talk. He's ready to tell us what really happened.
Arnold and I went out and to the little bar down the road, which I really shouldn't drink, obviously, because I black out. And it's horrifying.
They had gotten drunk and they walked home.
But it was late, and I went straight to bed. And when I got up, Arnold was trying to get me to help her and all that. And you could tell there had been some damage. And
what kind of damage, Sam?
Some face punches, stuff.
Okay.
She
wasn't doing real hot.
Exactly.
Were those punches from you? When you blocked out, more than likely?
More than likely.
Oh.
He's just like, yeah, I blacked out. I woke up and she was hurt really bad. It seemed like almost like he didn't really care as much.
Just snapped?
Yeah, I just know. I woke up. I don't even remember getting mad. That's the problem.
I don't believe you blacked out. I believe you knew what happened. He's admitting a little bit, but he doesn't want to go into all that detail because he knows what he did was really horrible. He said that he has assaulted Cindy before, and he's been involved in a few other domestics. We asked him why he hadn't called the hospital whenever Cindy was hurt.
I freaked out. It was all... We were both crazy freaks. Instead of calling the hospital.
It blows my mind that neither one of them called 911.
It didn't matter. And I knew. But she quit breathing on the bed over one of the nights.
We found out that Cindy's death wasn't immediate. It took a few days.
And we checked on her, stuff like that. And, but I was so freaked out, I couldn't even, it's a big fear.
He was thinking about himself and not her. He said that after she had passed away, they decided to take her and roll her up in the carpet, in the deep freezer. He kind of went about his normal day.
Sam is charged with the murder of Cindy Mudd. as well as the concealment of her body.
Sam didn't admit to remembering what he did, so we were hoping to ascertain that information from Arnold. So we had put out still images asking for the public's help in locating Arnold. Approximately 2 weeks later, Arnold is located in Beckley and arrested.
We charged Arnold with fraudulent use of someone's debit or credit card. He's placed in a regional jail. We were able to come to an agreement for an interview with Arnold. He tells us that Sam basically steps on her head 4 or 5 times. And when I say step, I mean with force. The deep freezer idea was Sam's idea, and Arnold did assist with disposing of her body. In January of 2023, Arnold Hiller pleads guilty to concealment and disposal of a body.
The fraud charges against Arnold are dropped as part of his guilty plea.
Arnold was sentenced to 1 to 5 years. In August of 2023, Samuel May pled guilty to second-degree murder, and he was handed a sentence of 40 years in a penitentiary maximum.
As part of the plea deal, prosecutors drop all other charges against Sam. Investigators piece together the events that led to Cindy's death.
The investigation revealed that Sam had a tendency to be violent. There was reported incidents involving him and Cynthia.
Michelle and Jessica had both said that he's very abusive towards women. One night in early July, Sam and Arnold go out to a bar and drink. When they got back from the bar, Cindy was up in the living room.
According to Sam, he blacked out and doesn't recall exactly what happened. But I would say he was in a fit of rage. He hit, most likely kicked Cynthia, causing a fractured rib and a fractured sternum.
The following day, he realized that he messed up and he needed help, and he knew Arnold would help him. They keep her alive for about 3 days.
They gave her water, trying to sustain her until she eventually died. And then the two of them conspired to hide her body by wrapping it in carpet. And then they put that carpet with Cynthia's body inside of a deep freezer. And took the freezer out to the backyard where they concealed it with a tarp and stacked other objects up around it. When Sam and Arnold were using her debit card at the Speedway in mid-July, they were using it after her death. When they realized that family had reported her missing is when they decided to leave the house.
On August 17th, Sam takes off the Life 360 tracking app, and they make it to the Quality Inn. Well, I think it just shows that both of them are very selfish, and, you know, they didn't want to get in trouble for what had happened, whereas, you know, if they had called 911 when she was alive, you know, there's a chance that they could have saved Cindy's life. I don't think there's really a big motive for Sam. I think he's just such an aggressive, like, just a bad person and thought he could get away with it. Cindy's kindness was definitely abused by Sam and Arnold.
CCTV was very helpful in this investigation, actually critical. Some put timelines down.
The surveillance footage in this case was a very big part. I think it would have took a lot longer to resolve if we didn't have the surveillance footage.
It hurts. And there's always that, well, maybe if I'd have just been forceful and, you know, gone in there and just taken her out, that she would finally leave him. And that just never happened. There's a lot of guilt involved. I miss her laugh. I miss the way that she hugs. I don't know where the world goes without Nan. I don't know where it's supposed to go without Nan. She's my mom. Person who loved me and taught me lessons and helped me when I needed her. If I could say anything to my mom today, I would want her to know how much she's loved and missed.
Next time on See No Evil.
911 emergency.
This was an intentionally set fire.
My son told me, no, Mom, he's been murdered.
What I never could have expected is video of them doing it. I mean, you can't even hope for something like that.
On a freezing Ohio night in late November 1999, the quiet town of Ashford fell asleep the way it always did. Streetlights humming, front porches glowing faint yellow, and the distant sound of freight trains sliding through the darkness. Nothing about that night suggested it would become the beginning of a mystery whispered about for decades. Nothing hinted that the word cold case would one day hang over this town like a shadow that refused to fade. The first sign that something was wrong came just after dawn. A newspaper carrier pedaled down Maple Street, tossing rolled papers onto lawns dusted with frost. It was the kind of routine that rarely changed. Same streets, same houses, same sleepy silence. Until he reached number 214. The front door stood slightly open. At first, he thought nothing of it. Maybe someone had forgotten to close it. Maybe a dog had pushed it open. But then he noticed the porch light still burning, long after sunrise. The screen door creaked gently in the cold wind. He hesitated. Something about the house felt wrong. Inside lived 27-year-old Emily Carter, a local elementary school teacher. Friendly, quiet, the kind of neighbor who remembered birthdays and waved from the driveway. But that morning, the house was silent. Too silent. The boy dropped the newspaper on the porch and rode away, uneasy but unsure why. By mid-morning, Emily didn't show up for work. At Ashford Elementary, her classroom sat empty. Students whispered. The principal checked the attendance board twice. Emily Carter was never late. By noon, calls went unanswered. By 2 o'clock, the school contacted her sister. By 4 in the afternoon, police were standing in front of the house on Maple Street. The door was still open. Inside, detectives found signs that something had happened. Something sudden, something violent, something that had left the house frozen in a moment of chaos. A coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter, half full. A chair lay tipped on its side. And on the living room carpet, there was blood. Not a pool, just a smear. A dark stain dragged across the floor. But Emily Carter was gone. No body. No note. No sign of forced entry. The house looked like someone had interrupted an ordinary evening and then vanished into the night. Police searched every room. Bedroom, bathroom, basement. Nothing. Her purse sat on the kitchen table. Her car remained parked outside. Her keys were still inside the house. Emily Carter had disappeared without taking a single thing. Within hours, Ashford was no longer a sleepy Ohio town. It was a crime scene. Patrol cars blocked the street. Yellow tape fluttered across the front yard. Neighbors gathered in clusters along the sidewalk, whispering. Someone had seen a dark car driving slowly down Maple Street around 10:30 the night before. Another neighbor reported hearing a loud thump, maybe furniture falling. But nobody called the police. Because nothing like this ever happened in Ashford. Not here. Not on Maple Street. Detectives moved carefully through the house, photographing everything. The blood smear was tested. It belonged to Emily Carter. But it wasn't enough blood to suggest death. Which meant one thing. She had been taken alive. The first theory was simple. Burglary gone wrong. Maybe someone broke in, surprised her, and things escalated. But the house hadn't been ransacked. Jewelry remained untouched. Electronics still plugged into the wall. Whoever came into that house didn't come to steal. They came for Emily. And they came quietly. The front door lock showed no damage, which meant Emily likely opened it herself. Someone she knew. Someone she trusted. Someone who stepped into that warm living room on a cold Ohio night and changed everything. By evening, search teams spread across Ashford. Volunteers combed nearby woods with flashlights. Police checked drainage ditches, riverbanks, abandoned buildings. Helicopters swept the area. Nothing. No footprints. No tire tracks. No witnesses who saw Emily leave the house. It was as if she had simply dissolved into the night. And as the days passed, the story began appearing in newspapers across Ohio. Local teacher missing. Police investigate possible abduction. Community in shock. The town watched as investigators interviewed everyone connected to Emily Carter. Friends. Coworkers. Neighbors. Former boyfriends. Anyone who might know why she vanished. But the more detectives looked, the stranger the story became. Emily had no enemies. No financial problems. No history of dangerous relationships. She lived a simple life, school, home, family visits on weekends. Yet somewhere inside that quiet routine, something had gone terribly wrong. Then came the discovery that changed the direction of the entire investigation. 3 days after Emily disappeared, a neighbor cleaning out his garage noticed something unusual near the curb. A thin red line. Dried blood. It ran along the edge of the pavement for several feet before disappearing into the street. Detectives arrived within minutes. The blood trail was faint but visible, and it pointed toward a spot where a vehicle may have been parked, which meant the abductor likely carried Emily outside, put her into a car, and drove away. The lab confirmed the blood matched Emily Carter, but the trail ended there. No camera footage, no license plates, just a cold November road where a woman vanished. Weeks turned into months. Searches expanded beyond Ashford. Nearby counties checked missing persons reports. Detectives followed tips from across the state. A truck driver thought he saw a woman matching Emily's description at a gas station. A waitress believed a nervous man dining alone mentioned her name. Every lead dissolved under investigation. The story that once dominated local headlines slowly faded, until one phrase began appearing in police files. A phrase that investigators hate more than almost anything. Cold case. Emily Carter's disappearance would soon join a long list of mysteries that refused to die. But what nobody knew in 1999, what nobody could imagine, was that the man responsible for her disappearance had been living quietly in Ashford the entire time. Watching, waiting, and keeping a secret that would remain buried for more than 20 years. The secret of what really happened inside that house on Maple Street. And why Emily Carter never came home. By the end of the first week, the air in Ashford had changed. Front doors that once stayed unlocked were suddenly bolted shut. Porch lights burned all night. Parents walked their children to school instead of letting them wander the quiet sidewalks alone. The disappearance of Emily Carter had crawled into the town's collective mind like a slow-moving storm, dark and impossible to ignore. And yet the case itself seemed to move nowhere. Detectives from the Ashford Police Department worked around the clock, piecing together the final known hours of Emily's life. Every receipt, every phone call, every moment of her day was laid out like fragments of a puzzle scattered across a table. Her last confirmed sighting was painfully ordinary. At 5:18 p.m. on November 23rd, Emily stopped at a small grocery store on the edge of town. Security footage showed her pushing a cart slowly through the aisles. Bread, milk, soup. The kind of thing someone buys before settling in for a quiet evening at home. She wore a long winter coat and a knitted scarf. Her hair pulled back loosely, a few strands falling across her face. She smiled briefly at the cashier while paying. Nothing about the footage suggested fear. Nothing suggested she was about to vanish. At 6:02 p.m., she drove away in her blue Honda Civic, headlights disappearing down the road toward Maple Street. That was the last confirmed moment Emily Carter was seen alive. Detectives returned to the grocery store footage again and again, hoping to catch something they had missed. A suspicious person in the background. a car following her through the parking lot. But every frame looked painfully normal, the kind of normal that haunts investigators, because it means the danger came later. Inside the house, somewhere between dinner and midnight, Emily's phone records told another quiet story. 3 calls that evening, one to her sister, lasting 12 minutes. They talked about Thanksgiving plans. Their parents were driving in from Cleveland. Emily had volunteered to host dinner this year. The second call was to a colleague from school, discussing a lesson plan for the following week. The third call, made just before 9 p.m., lasted only 30 seconds. It went to a number detectives did not immediately recognize. When investigators traced it, they found the line belonged to a payphone outside a gas station nearly 2 miles away. A payphone. In 1999, that detail wasn't unusual, but the timing was. The gas station clerk didn't remember who used the phone that night. The station served dozens of customers every evening. Whoever made that call had vanished into the ordinary flow of small-town life. Back on Maple Street, forensic teams continued processing the Carter home. The living room where the blood smear had been discovered became the center of attention. Investigators examined the carpet fibers, the coffee table, the overturned chair. The scene suggested a struggle. Not a long one, but sudden, violent. A single glass lay shattered near the couch, its fragments glinting under evidence lights. The kitchen mug, still half full, had gone cold hours before police arrived. Everything inside the house looked like someone had interrupted a quiet evening and turned it into chaos within seconds. Yet something was missing from the scene. There were no fingerprints belonging to a stranger. Only Emily's. And a handful belonging to people who had visited the home days or weeks earlier. Friends. Family. Neighbors. No forced entry. No unknown DNA. No weapon. Detectives began forming the theory that would dominate the early investigation. Emily knew her attacker. The door had been opened willingly. Someone stood on that porch late that night, knocking quietly under the dim porch light. Someone Emily recognized. Someone she trusted enough to let inside. The question was simple. Who? Interviews began spreading across Ashford like ripples in water. Teachers at the school described Emily as warm but private. She kept a tight circle of friends. She rarely dated. One colleague mentioned that Emily had recently ended a short relationship with a man from a nearby town. His name was Daniel Mercer. Mercer was 32, a mechanic who worked at an auto repair shop just outside Ashford. The relationship, according to friends, had lasted barely 3 months. Nothing dramatic. Just 2 people who realized they weren't right for each other. Detectives found Mercer easily. He lived alone in a small rental house across town. When police knocked on his door, he answered calmly. Too calmly, some investigators later said. Mercer told them exactly what they expected to hear. Yes, he had dated Emily. Yes, they broke up about 6 weeks earlier. No, there had been no argument. No resentment. No lingering contact. He claimed he hadn't spoken to her since early October. When asked where he was the night she disappeared, Mercer gave a straightforward answer. Home. Watching television. Alone. No witnesses. But also no evidence placing him near Maple Street. Detectives searched his home anyway. Nothing. No blood. No clothing fibers. No signs of struggle or violence. Even his car, a dark green pickup truck, showed no trace of Emily Carter. Mercer cooperated fully. He answered every question. He never raised his voice. Never seemed nervous. Never contradicted himself. After 2 long interviews, investigators had nothing that tied him directly to the crime. Still, something about Mercer lingered in their minds. The calmness. The distance. But suspicion alone wasn't evidence. And without evidence, the case drifted back into uncertainty. Weeks passed. Then months. Winter swallowed the town. Snow covered the fields where search teams once walked in straight lines, scanning the ground. Volunteers slowly stopped organizing search parties. The media attention faded. Other crimes filled headlines. Other tragedies captured the public's focus. But inside the Ashford Police Department, the Carter file continued to grow. Hundreds of pages. Interview transcripts, forensic reports, maps, photographs of the living room carpet where a smear of blood told a story that still refused to speak clearly. Detectives followed leads that stretched across state lines. One tip suggested Emily had been seen boarding a bus in Columbus. Another caller claimed she had been kidnapped by a drifter passing through town. Each theory collapsed under investigation. And slowly, painfully, investigators began facing a possibility they didn't want to say aloud. Emily Carter might already be dead. But without a body, the case remained suspended in a strange, maddening space. Too much evidence for a disappearance. Too little proof for a murder. By the summer of 2000, the file officially changed status. The words were stamped quietly across the case record. Cold case. But inside the quiet streets of Ashford, something about Emily Carter's disappearance refused to fade.
People still talked about that night.
About the porch light, the open door, the strange smear of blood across the living room carpet. And somewhere in town, a man who once dated Emily Carter continued living his life almost exactly as before. Working at the repair shop, buying groceries, nodding politely to neighbors, carrying inside his memory the truth about what happened on Maple Street. A truth that would remain hidden for more than 2 decades. Until one day, long after the town believed the mystery would never be solved, a single mistake would reopen everything. And the silence surrounding Emily Carter would finally begin to crack. Time has a strange way of burying things. In the beginning, the disappearance of Emily Carter was everywhere in Ashford. Her photo hung in the grocery store windows. Flyers were taped to telephone poles, bulletin boards, and gas station counters. Local news ran the story for weeks, the same photograph flashing across television screens. Emily smiling in a classroom, sunlight catching in her hair, the words "missing teacher" burning across the bottom of the screen. But months turned into a year, then 2. And the story began to slip quietly into the past. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but filed away somewhere deeper in the town's memory, like a bruise that had faded but never truly healed. Still, the investigation never completely stopped. Detectives revisited the Carter house more times than anyone could count. They retraced the timeline of November 23rd again and again, hoping some small detail might reveal what they had missed the first time. And there was always one detail that refused to sit comfortably: the blood. Not the smear on the living room carpet that had already been tested and cataloged. It was the small droplets found outside the house that kept bothering investigators. Forensic technicians had documented them carefully in the early days of the investigation. Tiny specks on the concrete edge of the driveway, barely visible unless you knew where to look. The droplets stretched toward the street, toward the spot where the faint trail had ended. But the pattern was strange. They weren't scattered randomly the way blood might fall during a chaotic struggle. They were spaced out, almost evenly, as if someone had been carried,
or dragged,
or lifted into a vehicle. Investigators believed the abductor likely parked along the curb, just beyond the Carter driveway, in a place partially hidden by a large oak tree. From there, whoever took Emily could have loaded her into a car without being easily seen from neighboring houses. It was quiet, efficient,
planned.
The more detectives examined the scene, the more one possibility began forming in their minds. This wasn't a random crime. Whoever came to that house knew exactly what they were doing. They knew Emily would open the door. They knew the layout of the house. And they knew how to get her out without alerting the entire neighborhood. That realization pushed investigators back toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. The person responsible probably lived nearby, or at least knew Ashford well enough to move through it without drawing attention. And that brought the detectives back, once again, to Daniel Mercer. In early 2001, nearly 14 months after Emily disappeared, investigators decided to take another look at him. Mercer had remained in Ashford the entire time. He still worked at the same auto shop just outside town, fixing engines and changing oil beneath buzzing fluorescent lights. He still drove the same green pickup truck. And, according to people who knew him, he had returned almost completely to his normal routine. When detectives showed up at the repair shop one gray February afternoon, Mercer didn't seem surprised. If anything, he looked tired. He wiped grease from his hands with a rag and followed the officers outside without protest. The second interview lasted nearly 3 hours. Detectives asked him the same questions again. Where were you that night? Did you speak to Emily? Did you visit Maple Street? Mercer gave the same answers he had given before. He had stayed home. He hadn't spoken to her since the breakup. He had nothing to do with her disappearance. His voice remained steady the entire time. His eyes never wandered.
But something small had changed.
It was the tone. Less patient. More defensive. When detectives pressed him about the possibility that Emily might have let him inside the house, Mercer leaned forward slightly and spoke with sudden sharpness. She broke up with me, he said. Why would I go back there? The question lingered in the room. Why would he? Detectives didn't have a clear answer. But they did know something else. Phone records from the night Emily disappeared had revealed that mysterious 30-second call to the payphone near the gas station. And the gas station sat less than half a mile from Mercer's house. That detail had always bothered investigators. Not enough for an arrest, but enough to keep Mercer's name alive in the case file. Detectives asked him if he had used the payphone that night. Mercer shook his head.
No.
His answer came quickly. Too quickly, one detective later said. But again, suspicion alone meant nothing. The investigation stalled. Years began sliding past. Ashford changed slowly with time. New houses appeared along the outskirts of town. The elementary school added another wing to handle growing enrollment. Children who once saw Emily Carter's missing posters grew into teenagers who barely remembered her name. But inside a metal filing cabinet at the Ashford Police Department, the Carter case remained. Stacked reports, photographs, evidence bags sealed and labeled with fading ink. And among them, a small envelope containing something investigators hoped might one day change everything. DNA. Back in 1999, forensic technology was limited. Detectives had collected every possible sample from the Carter house: fibers, fingerprints, hair strands, skin cells. But most of it had produced nothing useful, except for one small trace. A partial DNA profile recovered from beneath Emily's fingernails. At the time, the sample had been too degraded for a clear match. It was entered into national databases anyway, and for years, the system returned the same answer. No match. But science doesn't stay still. Throughout the early 2000s, DNA technology advanced faster than anyone expected. Laboratories developed new methods capable of analyzing samples that once seemed useless. Old evidence began solving old crimes. Cases long buried under the label cold case suddenly reopened. And by 2011, investigators in Ashford began wondering if the Carter file might hold secrets the original detectives simply couldn't see. The evidence was shipped to a state forensic lab for re-examination. Technicians worked carefully through each item. Clothing fibers, carpet samples, the broken glass from the living room, and finally, the DNA collected from beneath Emily Carter's fingernails. Weeks passed while analysts rebuilt the genetic profile piece by piece. When the results finally came back, investigators gathered in a small conference room at the police station. The lab had succeeded in producing a stronger DNA profile than ever before. Still partial, but clearer. Clear enough to search again through national databases. Detectives waited. Days passed. Then the phone rang. The database had returned a hit, but not the kind investigators expected. It wasn't a match to a known criminal. It was a partial familial match. Someone related to the unknown DNA profile. Someone whose DNA had been entered into the system for an unrelated arrest years earlier. The name attached to that entry made several detectives slowly exchange glances across the table. Because the person in the database lived just 20 miles away. And the family name connected to that DNA profile was one investigators already knew very well. Mercer. The same name as the man who once dated Emily Carter. The same name detectives had questioned twice. The same man who insisted he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Suddenly the quiet, buried case that had haunted Ashford for more than a decade was no longer sleeping. It was waking up. And somewhere in town, Daniel Mercer was still living his life the same way he had for years. Going to work, talking to neighbors, driving the same pickup truck past the same streets, unaware that the silence protecting him for more than a decade was beginning to crack. And that investigators were now looking at him again. This time with something they had never had before: evidence. The moment the lab report arrived, the air inside the Ashford Police Department shifted in a way that only seasoned investigators could feel. It wasn't celebration. Not yet. It was something quieter. Something sharper. The kind of tension that appears when a case long buried under dust suddenly takes a breath again. For more than a decade, Emily Carter's disappearance had lived inside a cardboard archive box labeled Cold Case, 1999. New detectives occasionally glanced at it, sometimes opening the file late at night out of curiosity or frustration, but the truth was brutal and simple. Without new evidence, the mystery had nowhere to go. Now, for the first time in years, something had changed. The DNA recovered from beneath Emily's fingernails, material investigators believed came from her attacker during the struggle in the living room, had finally produced a meaningful lead. Not a direct match, but a partial familial one. That meant someone related to the unknown contributor had been arrested at some point and entered into the national database. And that relative carried the same last name that had hovered around the investigation since the very beginning: Mercer. The detectives studying the lab report didn't speak for several seconds, because they all understood the implication. If the DNA belonged to someone in the Mercer family, the list of possibilities wasn't very long. Daniel Mercer had one brother, Thomas Mercer, 3 years younger. Thomas lived in Columbus and had a minor criminal record, mostly petty theft and a bar fight that led to an arrest in 2008. That arrest had put his DNA into the national system, which meant the partial match investigators just received likely came from someone closely related to him. A brother, a father, a son. But Thomas Mercer had never lived in Ashford. Daniel Mercer had. And Daniel Mercer had dated Emily Carter. The room went quiet again. For the first time in years, detectives began reopening the thick folders stacked on the table in front of them. Old interview transcripts, crime scene photographs, maps of Maple Street drawn in pencil during the early investigation. The pieces of the puzzle were exactly the same, but suddenly they looked different. The second look at Daniel Mercer began quietly. No dramatic raids. No media announcements. Just a small group of detectives working through the case again from the beginning, examining every moment of Mercer's life in the weeks surrounding Emily's disappearance. And the deeper they looked, the more small details began surfacing. Details that once seemed meaningless. Details that now felt different. The first came from Mercer's work schedule. Back in 1999, investigators had confirmed Mercer worked a regular shift at the auto repair shop. But the records also showed that he left work unusually early on the day Emily disappeared. At the time, the detail meant little. Employees left early all the time. But the timestamp suddenly looked uncomfortable. Mercer clocked out at 4:47 p.m., just over an hour before Emily Carter appeared on grocery store security footage. Another detail emerged when detectives re-interviewed Mercer's former coworkers. Most of them barely remembered the night Emily vanished. But one mechanic, a man named Harold Kimball, mentioned something strange. He remembered Mercer leaving work that evening in an unusually agitated mood. He slammed the locker shut, Kimball recalled. I remember that part. Harder than normal. When investigators asked why, Kimball shrugged. Just seemed pissed about something. At the time, no one connected that frustration to Emily Carter. But the new DNA lead forced detectives to reconsider everything. Then came the next discovery. A detail buried deep in a police report written nearly 23 years earlier. During the original investigation, detectives had canvassed every house on Maple Street asking neighbors what they saw the night Emily disappeared. One woman, an elderly widow named Margaret Holcomb, had told officers she noticed a pickup truck parked along the curb around 10 p.m. Dark green. Old model. She remembered it because it sat under the big oak tree across from Emily's driveway. The statement had been recorded and filed away. At the time, Ashford contained dozens of green pickup trucks. The description meant almost nothing. But Daniel Mercer owned one, a dark green Ford F-150. Suddenly, that forgotten witness statement began echoing louder in investigators' minds. The case, once quiet and cold, began building momentum again. Detectives contacted the state lab once more, requesting a deeper analysis of the DNA profile. They wanted to know exactly how strong the familial connection might be. Weeks passed. Then the new report arrived. The genetic markers suggested something extremely specific. The unknown DNA contributor was very likely a sibling of Thomas Mercer, which meant one person immediately rose to the top of the list. Daniel Mercer, the man who had once stood inside Emily Carter's living room. The man who insisted he hadn't spoken to her after the breakup. The man who lived barely 2 miles from the house where she vanished. But suspicion, even strong suspicion, still wasn't enough. Investigators needed something direct. Something undeniable. Which meant they needed Daniel Mercer's DNA. The problem was simple. Mercer had never been arrested. And without probable cause, police couldn't simply demand a sample. So detectives did what investigators often do when a case reaches this delicate stage. They watched. For several weeks, Daniel Mercer had no idea he was being quietly observed. Detectives followed him through his normal routine. Morning drives to work. Evening stops at the grocery store. Weekend trips to a local bar where he drank beer alone near the end of the counter. Mercer looked older now. His hair had thinned. Lines had formed around his eyes. But his life appeared steady and predictable. No sudden panic. No sign he suspected the past was creeping back toward him. And then, one chilly Thursday afternoon, Mercer made a mistake. It was small, almost invisible, but it was exactly what investigators needed. After finishing lunch at a roadside diner, Mercer stepped outside and tossed a paper coffee cup into a trash can near the parking lot. Detectives watching from across the street waited until he drove away. Then one of them walked casually toward the trash can. Inside, among crumpled napkins and food wrappers, sat the cup Mercer had used only minutes earlier. The rim still carried traces of saliva. The cup was carefully sealed in an evidence bag.
Sent to the lab.
And everyone waited. Because if the DNA from that cup matched the profile taken from beneath Emily Carter's fingernails, the quiet mechanic who had lived peacefully in Ashford for more than 20 years would suddenly become the center of one of the town's darkest secrets. But the real shock was still waiting. Because even if the DNA confirmed what detectives suspected, one question still loomed over the entire case. A question that had haunted Ashford since that cold November morning in 1999. Where was Emily Carter? And what exactly had happened inside that living room on Maple Street? The evidence bag containing the discarded coffee cup arrived at the state forensic laboratory 2 days later. Inside, technicians treated it with the same meticulous care they would give to any major piece of evidence.
Gloves.
Sterile instruments. Clean workspaces. Every step documented. To anyone outside the investigation, it looked like an ordinary paper cup from a roadside diner. But to the detectives waiting back in Ashford, it carried the weight of 23 years. For more than 2 decades, Emily Carter's case had lived in that strange limbo between suspicion and proof. Daniel Mercer had always hovered near the center of the mystery, like a shadow just out of reach. He had dated Emily. He had lived nearby. His pickup truck matched a vague witness description. But none of it had ever been enough. Now, everything depended on a few invisible strands of DNA. The laboratory began the process of extracting genetic material from the rim of the cup. It didn't take long to find what they needed. Mercer's saliva had left a clear sample. Technicians built a full DNA profile and then compared it to the one recovered from beneath Emily Carter's fingernails. The comparison didn't happen instantly. In forensic labs, results never do. Computers process the sequences slowly, aligning genetic markers one by one. The process took hours. Then another round of verification began to eliminate the possibility of contamination or error. While the lab worked, detectives in Ashford waited. And waiting is the hardest part of a cold case. Because when a case has slept for decades, the smallest new development feels enormous. Detective Laura Briggs, who had inherited the Carter file 5 years earlier, spent that week rereading every page of the original investigation. She studied crime scene photos until the images burned into her mind. The overturned chair, the broken glass, the smear of blood across the carpet. Those photographs had always suggested something violent happened inside that living room, but without knowing who caused it, they were just frozen moments in time. Now Briggs looked at them differently, because somewhere inside those images was the moment when Emily Carter fought back. And if the DNA beneath her fingernails belonged to Daniel Mercer, it meant she had scratched him. Hard enough to tear skin. Hard enough to leave genetic evidence that waited 23 years to be understood. 3 days later, the lab called. Briggs took the call in a quiet hallway outside the squad room. The analyst's voice was calm, professional, but the meaning of the words hit like a hammer. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the profile recovered from beneath Emily Carter's fingernails. Not a partial match. Not a possible match. A direct match. Daniel Mercer's DNA had been under Emily Carter's fingernails the night she disappeared. Briggs closed her eyes for a moment after the call ended. For 23 years, Mercer had lived quietly in the same town where Emily vanished. He had walked past neighbors who still remembered her. He had fixed cars for customers who once helped search the woods looking for her body. And the entire time, the answer had been sitting just beneath the surface of a cold case file. Within hours, the investigation shifted into motion. Prosecutors were contacted. Search warrants were prepared. But even with the DNA match, the case was still incomplete.
There was still no body.
No weapon. No confession. And defense attorneys often build entire cases around those missing pieces. So investigators knew they needed more. Much more. The next step focused on Mercer's property. His small house sat on a quiet road at the edge of Ashford, surrounded by patchy grass and a narrow driveway. It looked like the home of a man who lived alone and kept mostly to himself. Neighbors described Mercer the same way they always had. Quiet. Polite. Private. The kind of man who nodded politely while checking his mailbox, but rarely stopped to talk. No one had ever imagined he might be connected to the town's most haunting mystery. Early one morning, a team of investigators arrived with the warrant. Mercer wasn't home yet. He had already left for work, which meant detectives had time to examine every inch of the property. Inside, the house looked almost exactly as it had decades earlier when officers first searched it. Sparse furniture, neutral walls, a small television in the living room. Nothing immediately suspicious. But investigators weren't looking for obvious signs of violence anymore. They were searching for traces, tiny details, anything that might connect Mercer to the events inside Emily Carter's home. In the bedroom closet, they found several old jackets dating back to the late 1990s. In the garage, they examined Mercer's tools, shelves of engine parts, and boxes of stored belongings. One box caught Detective Briggs' attention. It sat on a high shelf near the back wall, coated in a layer of dust thick enough to suggest it hadn't been opened in years. Inside were old photographs, receipts, and a few personal items from Mercer's younger days. And at the bottom of the box, folded carefully, was a piece of fabric. A scarf. Light blue. Detectives photographed it immediately, because 23 years earlier, witnesses at the grocery store had described Emily Carter wearing a knitted scarf when she left the store that evening. And the one lying in Mercer's box looked painfully familiar.
The fabric was sent to the lab.
Tests began immediately. Meanwhile, detectives also took soil samples from Mercer's backyard, examining the ground for any sign it had been disturbed years earlier. They brought in ground-penetrating radar. The machine rolled slowly across the yard, sending signals beneath the earth, searching for disturbances in the soil layers. Investigators watched the monitor carefully, but the screen showed nothing unusual. No buried remains. No hidden grave. Which brought the investigation back to the question that had haunted the case from the very beginning. If Daniel Mercer was responsible, where was Emily Carter? The answer might have been lost forever if not for something investigators discovered later that same day inside Mercer's garage. Behind a stack of old tires sat a rusted metal toolbox. It looked ordinary, just another mechanic's storage case. But inside, detectives found something they had never expected to see. A small folding knife, its blade slightly stained, dark spots clinging near the hinge. Even after all these years, the knife was sealed in an evidence bag and rushed to the lab. And as detectives left Mercer's house that afternoon, they all understood something important. The quiet man who had lived undisturbed for decades was no longer just a person of interest. He was the center of the storm. And very soon, Daniel Mercer would learn that the past he thought was buried had finally come back for him. The folding knife arrived at the forensic lab late that evening. Even after more than 2 decades, the blade still carried faint discolorations near the hinge, small dark stains that time had dulled but not erased. To the untrained eye, it could have been rust, old grease, or residue from any number of ordinary tasks. But to forensic analysts, the stains looked familiar. Too familiar. The blade was photographed from every angle, catalogued, and placed beneath a powerful microscope. Tiny scrapings were carefully removed from the crevice, where the blade folded into the handle. Then the testing began. Back in Ashford, Detective Laura Briggs sat alone in the dim squad room, the Carter files spread across the table in front of her. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly overhead, and outside the station windows the town had already fallen into night. She studied the photographs again. Emily's living room. The broken glass. The smear of blood across the carpet. For 23 years those images had felt incomplete, like a sentence missing its final word. Now that word might finally be forming. But Briggs knew the hardest part of a cold case wasn't finding the suspect. It was proving what happened. Without a body, every piece of evidence had to speak louder. The next morning, the lab called again. The stains on the knife had tested positive for blood. And although the sample had degraded over time, analysts were able to extract enough DNA to run a comparison. Hours later, the result came back. The blood on the blade matched Emily Carter. When Briggs heard the confirmation, she didn't celebrate. Instead, she felt the strange quiet that comes when a mystery finally begins to collapse into truth. Daniel Mercer now stood connected to Emily Carter in 3 ways that could not be explained away. His DNA beneath her fingernails, her blood on a knife found in his possession, and the scarf believed to belong to her hidden inside his garage. It was enough. By late afternoon, the prosecutor approved an arrest warrant. The news moved quickly through the small department. Detectives gathered in the briefing room as the plan unfolded. Mercer would be picked up at the repair shop.
Simple. Direct.
No warning. The shop sat just outside town near a stretch of highway where trucks passed steadily throughout the day. Inside, the air always smelled like oil and warm metal, and the clatter of tools echoed against concrete floors. At 4:12 p.m., 4 police vehicles rolled quietly into the parking lot. Daniel Mercer was beneath the hood of a pickup truck when officers stepped inside. He didn't see them at first. His hands were deep inside the engine compartment, tightening a bolt. "Daniel Mercer," one officer said firmly. Mercer looked up. For a moment his expression showed nothing but mild confusion. Then he noticed the badges, the uniforms, the handcuffs hanging at the officer's belt. And something shifted in his face. Not panic, not anger, just a slow tightening of the jaw. "You're under arrest for the murder of Emily Carter," the officer continued. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The mechanics nearby stopped working. Tools fell silent. Someone in the back whispered, "Jesus." Mercer didn't resist. He slowly wiped his hands on a rag and allowed the officers to place the cuffs around his wrists. As they led him outside, the sound of traffic continued passing on the highway just beyond the parking lot. Normal life moving forward. Unaware that one of Ashford's longest and darkest mysteries had just taken its first real step toward resolution. But the arrest was only the beginning, because investigators still needed the truth. They needed Mercer to speak. Inside the interrogation room that night, the man who had lived quietly for decades finally sat across from detectives again. The same room, the same kind of table. But this time, everything was different. Detective Briggs placed a photograph on the table. Emily Carter, smiling in a school portrait taken the year before she disappeared. Mercer stared at it without expression. Then Briggs slid another photograph forward. The knife. Evidence tags attached to the handle. "We found it in your garage," she said. Mercer said nothing. Another photograph appeared. The scarf. Then the lab report confirming Emily's blood on the blade. Still nothing. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, Briggs placed the final document on the table. The DNA match. Mercer's genetic profile aligned perfectly with a sample taken from beneath Emily's fingernails. "You were in her house that night," Briggs said quietly. Mercer leaned back slightly in his chair. For the first time since the interview began, he looked tired. Really tired. Like a man carrying something heavy for far too long. "You fought with her," Briggs continued. "She scratched you." Mercer stared at the wall for several seconds. Then his eyes slowly returned to the photograph of Emily Carter lying on the table. And something in his face changed. A crack.
Small.
But unmistakable. Because after 23 years of silence, the wall around the truth was finally beginning to break. The question now wasn't whether Daniel Mercer had been in that house. The evidence had already answered that. The real question, the one that had haunted Ashford since 1999, was far darker. What exactly happened inside Emily Carter's living room on that cold November night? And where had her body gone? The answer sat only a few feet away. Inside the mind of a man who had carried the secret for more than 2 decades. And before the night was over, Daniel Mercer would finally begin to talk. The interrogation room felt smaller as the hours passed. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow across the metal table where the photographs lay scattered. Emily Carter smiling from a school portrait, the knife sealed inside an evidence bag, the faded blue scarf recovered from Mercer's garage. Daniel Mercer stared at them, without speaking. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the building's ventilation system and the occasional shuffle of paper as Detective Laura Briggs adjusted the evidence in front of him. 23 years. That was how long Mercer had carried the silence. 23 years of waking up every morning, driving to work, exchanging polite greetings with neighbors who still remembered Emily Carter's disappearance. 23 years of pretending nothing had happened. Briggs watched him carefully. Experienced interrogators know the moment when a suspect begins to bend. It's rarely dramatic. There's no sudden confession, no burst of emotion. It's smaller, a shift in posture, a long exhale, a glance that lingers too long on a photograph. Mercer's eyes kept drifting back to the picture of Emily. Finally, after nearly 40 minutes of silence, he spoke. His voice was low, almost distant. "I didn't mean to kill her." The words settled in the room like dust. Detective Briggs didn't interrupt. Mercer looked down at his hands, still faintly stained with the dark traces of grease from the repair shop where he had been arrested only hours earlier. "She wasn't supposed to die," he murmured. Briggs slid a recorder closer across the table. "Tell me what happened, Daniel." Mercer leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling for a moment, as if replaying something in his mind that had never truly left him. Then he began. It started with anger. That was the first thing he admitted. The breakup with Emily had seemed simple on the surface. A quiet conversation, polite words, 2 people deciding they weren't right for each other. But Mercer said the truth was uglier. He had been obsessed with her. Emily was everything he thought his life should be: kind, stable, respected in the community. When she ended the relationship, Mercer told detectives it felt like something inside him had collapsed. "She acted like it was nothing," he said quietly. "Like we were just done." In the weeks after the breakup, Mercer continued driving past her house. Sometimes late at night, sometimes during the day. He told himself he just wanted to see if her car was there, to know if she was home. But deep down, he admitted he couldn't let go. On the evening of November 23, 1999, Mercer finished work early. The frustration had been building all day. He drove aimlessly through Ashford for nearly an hour before ending up near Maple Street. Emily's porch light was on. Her car sat in the driveway. And something inside Mercer decided that night would be different. I just wanted to talk, he said. That was how he described it. Just talk. He parked the truck beneath the large oak tree across from the Carter house. The same spot Margaret Holcomb had described years earlier. Then he walked up the driveway. The porch light buzzed faintly above him as he knocked. When Emily opened the door, Mercer said she looked surprised. Not frightened. Just surprised. She asked what I was doing there, he recalled. Mercer told her he wanted to talk about the breakup. To understand why she ended things so suddenly. Emily hesitated for a moment before stepping aside and letting him in. It was cold outside. The house felt warm. Inside, the two of them sat in the living room. Emily had been drinking tea. The mug still sat on the kitchen counter. At first the conversation remained calm. But it didn't stay that way. Mercer said he asked if there was someone else. Emily told him no. She simply didn't feel the relationship was right. She tried to explain gently, the same way she had weeks earlier. But Mercer said something about the way she spoke, so calm, so certain, made the anger boil over. You never even tried, he said he told her. Emily stood up. She wanted the conversation to end. Mercer stood too. The argument escalated quickly. Voices rose. The chair tipped over when Mercer grabbed her arm. Emily tried to pull away. And that was when everything spun out of control. She scratched me, Mercer said. His voice trembled slightly. She scratched my face. The room fell silent again. Mercer rubbed his forehead slowly, as if feeling the ghost of the wound that had healed decades earlier. The scratch had been deep enough to draw blood. In that instant, Mercer said something inside him snapped. He pulled the folding knife from his pocket. Detective Briggs leaned forward slightly. The knife from your garage? Mercer nodded. He had carried it every day for years. Used it for small tasks at the repair shop. Opening boxes. Cutting hoses. But that night, inside Emily Carter's living room, it became something else. Emily saw the knife and tried to back away. But Mercer was already too close. She said my name, he whispered. Then he looked down at the photograph of the blade on the table. And I stabbed her. The words landed heavily in the quiet room. Mercer described the moment in fragments. The shock on Emily's face. The sound of the glass falling from the table. The sudden silence afterward. She collapsed onto the carpet. Blood spreading across the floor. The same smear investigators had photographed 23 years earlier. I didn't mean to, Mercer stopped, swallowing hard. But she stopped moving. Detective Briggs remained calm. Then what did you do? Mercer exhaled slowly. The story wasn't finished. Not even close. Because after Emily Carter died on that living room floor, Daniel Mercer had faced the decision that would bury the truth for more than 2 decades. And the choice he made next would haunt the town of Ashford for years to come. For a long moment after the confession, the interrogation room fell completely silent. Detective Laura Briggs didn't interrupt. She knew the most dangerous thing an investigator can do during a confession is rush the story. When someone finally begins to unload a secret they've buried for decades, the words come slowly at first, uneven, fragile, like something being pulled from deep underwater. Daniel Mercer sat motionless, staring at the table. The photograph of Emily Carter still lay between them. And now the room held the weight of the truth everyone in Ashford had wondered about for 23 years. You stabbed her, Briggs said quietly. Mercer nodded once. Not dramatically. Just a small motion of the head. She fell, he murmured. Right there in the living room. His eyes drifted toward the photograph of the blood smear investigators had taken in 1999. She didn't scream after that, he continued. It was just quiet. Mercer described kneeling beside her. He said at first he thought she might still be alive. The shock of the moment had blurred everything. The argument, the knife, the sound of glass breaking. But when he touched her shoulder, she didn't move. Her breathing had stopped. The room had gone still except for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. And in that moment, Mercer realized what he had done. Emily Carter was dead. The words came slowly now, like stones dropping into water. I panicked. Detective Briggs leaned forward slightly. What did you do next? Mercer rubbed his hands together nervously, as if trying to wipe away something that had been there for years. I didn't know what else to do. He stood in the living room for several minutes, staring at her body. The knife still sat in his hand. The carpet beneath her had already begun absorbing the blood. Mercer said his mind raced through possibilities, calling for help, running away, pretending it never happened. But every path led to the same place. Prison. His life ending in a single terrible moment. So instead, Mercer made a decision that would trap the truth inside a lie for decades. He decided to hide what he had done. First, he wiped the knife quickly on a dish towel he found in the kitchen. Then he slipped it back into his pocket. The room still smelled faintly of tea and spilled glass. Emily lay motionless on the floor. Mercer said he stood there again, frozen, until another fear crept into his mind. Someone might come looking for her. A neighbor might walk past the house. A car might drive by and see him leaving. The longer he stayed inside, the greater the risk. So he acted quickly. Mercer dragged Emily's body across the carpet toward the front door. That was how the blood smear investigators discovered years later had formed, a slow streak across the living room floor where her body had moved. He opened the door carefully and looked outside. The street was empty. Maple Street was always quiet at night. The porch light cast a pale circle across the driveway. Mercer carried her outside. The cold November air hit him immediately, sharp and biting. He moved quickly across the driveway and toward the curb where his truck waited beneath the large oak tree. The same tree the neighbor had remembered. He opened the passenger side door and lifted Emily into the seat. Her head leaned awkwardly against the window. Mercer closed the door and walked back toward the house. One last look. The front door still stood open. The living room still showed signs of the struggle. But Mercer knew he couldn't fix everything. So he did the only thing he could think of. He left. Driving slowly down Maple Street, he tried to act normal, tried to breathe steadily. But beside him, the silent shape in the passenger seat reminded him that nothing would ever be normal again. Detective Briggs listened without interrupting. The story that had haunted Ashford was finally unfolding. But the most important questions still hung in the air. What happened to her body? Briggs asked quietly. Mercer stared at the wall again. Outside the interrogation room, officers moved through the station hallway, unaware of the exact moment the truth of the Carter case was finally surfacing. I drove for a while, Mercer said. He described leaving Ashford and heading toward the rural roads outside town. Dark farmland stretched for miles there. Empty fields. Quiet creeks. Places where no one would notice a car parked along the roadside in the middle of the night. Mercer said he drove nearly 40 minutes before stopping. There was an old service road leading into a wooded area once used for logging. Few people went there anymore. It was the kind of place someone could disappear. I carried her into the woods, Mercer said. His voice had become distant now, almost mechanical, as if the memory had been replayed so many times it no longer felt real. I walked until I couldn't see the road anymore. The trees blocked most of the moonlight. The ground was soft with fallen leaves. Mercer laid Emily's body near a shallow depression in the earth. He didn't bring tools. He didn't dig a proper grave. Instead, he covered her with branches and leaves, pushing the forest floor over her until the shape beneath disappeared. I thought animals would find her, he said quietly. And no one would ever know. Afterward, Mercer returned to the truck and drove home. He washed the knife. He cleaned his hands. He put the weapon inside the toolbox in his garage. Then he went to bed. The next morning, the town woke up to the beginning of the mystery that would haunt it for decades. A newspaper carrier noticed the door open. Police found the blood. Search teams combed the woods. And Daniel Mercer stood among the volunteers for a short time that afternoon, pretending to help look for the woman he had killed only hours earlier. The room went silent again. Detective Briggs studied the man sitting across from her. For 23 years, the town of Ashford had lived with unanswered questions. Now the truth was finally sitting in front of them. But one final step remained: finding Emily Carter. And confirming that the place Mercer described in the woods was where the story truly ended. Because until her body was found, the ghost of the cold case would still linger over Ashford. And the next morning, investigators would drive out to the forest where Daniel Mercer claimed he had left her all those years ago. By sunrise the next morning, the quiet town of Ashford woke to a development no one had expected to hear in their lifetime. Daniel Mercer had confessed. For 23 years, the Carter case had been the town's oldest mystery, a story whispered in grocery store aisles and remembered during late-night conversations between neighbors who still recalled the winter of 1999. Now, the man many had quietly suspected, but never proven guilty, was sitting in a holding cell inside the Ashford Police Department. And somewhere in the woods beyond town, Mercer claimed Emily Carter had been left behind. Detective Laura Briggs didn't waste time. Within hours of the confession, a search team assembled outside the station. State investigators, forensic specialists, and county deputies gathered beside a line of vehicles preparing to drive toward the remote wooded area Mercer described. The morning air was cold, the kind of gray Ohio morning where the sky hangs low and the wind moves through bare trees with a hollow sound. Mercer rode in the back of a police vehicle. His wrists were cuffed, his expression distant. He had agreed to show investigators the location. The drive lasted nearly 40 minutes, just as he had described during the interrogation. The paved road slowly gave way to narrower rural lanes, then finally to a gravel service road barely wide enough for two vehicles to pass. Tall trees surrounded the area. The forest here was dense, older than the small towns scattered around it. Few people visited anymore. When the convoy reached the spot Mercer indicated, the vehicles stopped along the side of the dirt road. The forest stretched silently in every direction. Mercer stepped out slowly under the watchful eyes of deputies. For a moment he simply stared into the trees, as if searching for a landmark buried in memories more than 2 decades old. "Which way?" Detective Briggs asked. Mercer lifted one hand and pointed toward a narrow opening between 2 large oak trees. "That way." The search team moved carefully into the woods. Dry leaves crunched beneath boots as investigators followed Mercer deeper into the forest. Sunlight filtered through the branches in thin beams, illuminating patches of ground that had remained untouched for years. Every step forward carried a strange weight. For decades, search teams had combed fields, rivers, and abandoned buildings looking for any trace of Emily Carter. Now they were walking toward the place where Mercer said the story ended. After nearly 10 minutes, Mercer slowed. He looked around uncertainly. The forest had changed over time. New trees had grown. Fallen branches covered the ground. Memories blurred with reality. But then he stopped. "There," he said quietly. He pointed toward a small depression near the base of a large fallen tree. At first glance, nothing about the spot looked unusual. Just earth. Leaves. Roots pushing through the soil. But investigators had seen enough burial sites to know that time often hides the truth well. Forensic technicians began examining the ground carefully. They marked a perimeter and started gently clearing away the thick layer of leaves covering the area. The first sign appeared within minutes. A fragment.
Small.
Pale against the dark soil. One of the technicians froze. "Bone," he said softly. The forest went silent. The digging continued slowly, deliberately. Layer by layer, the earth gave up what it had been holding for 23 years. More fragments appeared.
Ribs.
Portions of a skull. Remnants of clothing decayed almost beyond recognition. But one detail confirmed everything. Wrapped loosely around the remains of the neck was a strip of faded blue fabric. The scarf. The same scarf investigators had found hidden in Mercer's garage. The same one witnesses remembered Emily Carter wearing the night she vanished. For a moment no one spoke. The wind moved through the trees with a low whisper. After decades of searching, the missing teacher from Ashford had finally been found. Mercer stood several yards away under guard, watching the scene unfold. His face remained expressionless. Perhaps he had replayed this moment so many times in his mind that the reality no longer carried the shock it might have once held. But for the detectives, the discovery carried enormous weight. Because this wasn't just a body. It was the final piece of a mystery that had haunted the town since the late 1990s. Forensic teams carefully documented the site. Photographs, measurements, evidence markers placed beside each bone fragment. Even after 23 years, the remains could still tell a story. Later examinations would confirm the cause of death consistent with Mercer's confession, the stab wound he described during interrogation. As investigators worked, news of the discovery began spreading through Ashford. Local reporters arrived near the entrance to the service road. Police tape-blocked the path, while officers kept curious onlookers at a distance. People who remembered Emily Carter gathered quietly along the roadside. Some stood in silence. Others spoke softly about the day she disappeared. And many simply stared into the forest where the truth had been hiding all along. By late afternoon, the remains were carefully removed and transported to the county medical examiner's office. Daniel Mercer was placed back into the police vehicle. This time, the ride back to Ashford felt different. The case that had once been a mystery now had a body, a confession, and a crime scene. The cold case that began with an open door on Maple Street had finally reached its final chapter. But for the Carter family, the discovery brought emotions far more complicated than relief. Because after 23 years of unanswered questions, the truth had arrived in the form of bones beneath the forest floor. And the man responsible was no longer just a suspect. He was now facing the full weight of justice for a crime that had stolen a young teacher from her home and left a community searching for answers for more than 2 decades. The news reached Ashford before the sun finished setting. At first it spread quietly, through phone calls, text messages, whispers exchanged between neighbors standing in grocery store aisles. Then the local news stations confirmed it. Human remains had been found in the woods outside town. And the man who had lived quietly among them for more than 2 decades had confessed to killing Emily Carter. The shock rippled through the community like an earthquake beneath familiar ground. For years, Emily's disappearance had been a ghost story people spoke about carefully, the kind of tragedy that lived in memory but never truly had an ending. Children who grew up hearing about the case were now adults with families of their own. Many had assumed the truth would never be known. But now the answer had finally surfaced, and it was far closer than anyone imagined. Daniel Mercer had never left. He had stayed in Ashford all along. The mechanic who nodded politely at customers, the man who bought coffee at the same diner every morning, the quiet neighbor who rarely spoke more than a few words, he had been carrying the town's darkest secret for 23 years. That realization hit people harder than the confession itself. Because it meant the mystery wasn't some distant horror that happened somewhere else. It happened here, on Maple Street, inside a warm living room on a cold November night, while the town slept. At the county medical examiner's office, forensic specialists worked late into the evening examining the remains recovered from the forest. Despite the passage of time, the evidence still spoke clearly. Bone fragments confirmed the identity through dental records. The clothing remnants matched the outfit Emily Carter had been wearing the night she disappeared. And most importantly, the skeletal remains showed damage consistent with a stab wound to the chest. The story Daniel Mercer had told investigators inside the interrogation room matched the physical evidence. For the first time since 1999, the case that once seemed impossible to solve had become painfully clear. Emily Carter had been murdered in her own home. Her body had been carried into the night. And the man responsible had walked free for more than 2 decades. Meanwhile, inside the Ashford Police Department, Mercer sat alone in a holding cell. The fluorescent lights above the hallway cast pale shadows through the bars. Outside the cell, officers moved quietly, aware that history had just unfolded inside their small station. Mercer's confession had been recorded in full. Prosecutors were already preparing the charges. First-degree murder, tampering with evidence, abuse of a corpse. The legal process that would follow could take months, maybe longer. But the outcome now seemed almost inevitable. Because Mercer had not only confessed, he had led investigators directly to the body. And in cases like that, the truth becomes impossible to escape. Late that evening, Detective Laura Briggs finally made the call she had been preparing for all day. Emily Carter's sister, Melissa, answered after the second ring. For a moment, Briggs could hear only silence on the line. Then Melissa spoke softly. "You found her." It wasn't a question, just a quiet statement. Briggs confirmed the discovery. She explained that Daniel Mercer had confessed. She told Melissa the remains had been recovered from the woods and were being examined by the medical examiner. The line went silent again. When Melissa finally spoke, her voice trembled. "For 23 years, we didn't know," she said. The Carter family had lived with that uncertainty longer than most people could imagine. Every holiday, every birthday, every Thanksgiving dinner, where Emily's chair sat empty, they had wondered where she was, whether she had suffered, whether someone out there knew the truth. Now they finally had the answer. But closure is rarely simple, because the truth, when it finally arrives, often carries pain with it. The following morning, news crews gathered outside the Ashford Police Department. Cameras pointed toward the front entrance as reporters prepared to broadcast the update that would ripple far beyond the small Ohio town. Behind them stood residents who had come simply to watch. Some remembered Emily Carter personally. Others only knew her story through the years of headlines that followed her disappearance. But everyone understood the significance of what had happened. A cold case from 1999 had finally been solved. Inside the station, Mercer was escorted from a holding cell to a transport vehicle. He moved slowly, shoulders slightly hunched, his expression unreadable. The same man who had lived quietly among them for decades now walked past flashing cameras and microphones. No one shouted questions. No one called his name. The crowd simply watched in stunned silence. Because in small towns, the worst crimes always feel personal. As the vehicle door closed and the convoy pulled away, the mystery that had once consumed Ashford finally began transitioning into something else. Not rumor, not speculation, but a completed story. One that began with an open door on Maple Street in 1999 and ended with a confession more than 2 decades later. Yet even as justice moved forward, something lingered in the air over the town. A strange quiet, because some wounds never fully disappear. And some stories leave shadows long after the truth has been revealed. Emily Carter's name would no longer sit inside a cold case file. But the memory of the night she vanished, the night an ordinary argument turned into murder, would remain etched into Ashford's history forever. Long after the cameras left and the police tape disappeared from Maple Street, the quiet town of Ashford returned to the rhythms it had always known. Cars moved slowly down the same narrow roads. Children walked to school beneath rows of aging trees. Porch lights flickered on each evening as the sun slipped behind the rooftops. From the outside, life seemed unchanged. But the truth had settled into the town like a permanent shadow. Because everyone now knew exactly what had happened on that cold night in 1999. Inside the Carter house, an ordinary conversation had turned into an argument. An argument had turned into violence. And violence had stolen a young woman from her home, leaving behind a mystery that would haunt Ashford for more than 2 decades. The house itself had long since been sold. New owners had moved in years earlier, unaware at first of the history that lived inside those walls. Over time, word spread quietly through neighbors and real estate records until the story became impossible to ignore. People driving past Maple Street sometimes slowed down. They looked at the porch. The same porch where Emily Carter had opened the door to someone she once trusted. And they wondered how something so ordinary could end in something so terrible. For the Carter family, the discovery in the woods brought a kind of closure that had once seemed impossible. Emily's remains were finally returned to them. After 23 years of waiting, they were able to hold a funeral. Friends from the elementary school attended. Former students, now adults themselves, came to pay their respects to the teacher they remembered from childhood. The service was quiet. No dramatic speeches. No anger shouted into the air. Just a room filled with people who had carried Emily's memory for a very long time. A photograph of her stood near the front of the chapel. The same warm smile that had once appeared on missing person posters now watched over the room one final time. Outside the courthouse months later, the final chapter of the case unfolded. Daniel Mercer entered a guilty plea. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The DNA beneath Emily's fingernails, her blood on the knife hidden in his garage, the scarf he had kept for decades, and the location of the grave only he could have known. There was no trial, no dramatic courtroom battle, just the quiet acknowledgement of what had happened. The judge sentenced Mercer to life in prison. As the sentence was read, Mercer stood motionless. The same expressionless calm he had carried through most of the investigation remained on his face. But for the Carter family sitting in the courtroom, the moment carried a different meaning. The man who had taken Emily Carter's life would never walk freely again. Justice, even delayed by 23 years, had finally arrived. Yet the story of the Carter case lingered in ways that went beyond the courtroom. In Ashford, people continued talking about the strange details that define the mystery. How Mercer had lived only minutes away from the house where the crime occurred. How he had joined search efforts during the early days, pretending to help look for the woman he had already buried in the woods. How an invisible trace of DNA, no larger than a grain of dust beneath Emily's fingernails, had quietly waited decades to reveal the truth. It was a reminder that some secrets cannot remain hidden forever.
Science had changed.
Technology had improved. And the evidence Mercer believed would vanish with time had instead become the key that solved the case. For Detective Laura Briggs, the file that once filled an entire drawer in the department archives finally moved to a different shelf. Not cold case.
Closed.
The label seemed simple, but inside the folder remained the photographs, reports, and memories of a mystery that had stretched across generations. Briggs sometimes thought about the strange path the investigation had taken, how the answer had existed from the very beginning. Daniel Mercer had always been part of the story. He had simply waited for time to bury the evidence. But time had done the opposite. It had preserved it. And eventually, it had forced the truth into the open. Years later, people in Ashford still remembered the night everything changed. They remembered the newspaper carrier who noticed the open door, the first police cars arriving on Maple Street, the search teams combing fields and forests while winter crept across Ohio. And they remembered the moment when the cold case that seemed destined to remain unsolved suddenly came back to life. The story of Emily Carter became something more than a crime. It became a warning, a reminder that even the quietest towns can hide terrible secrets, that trust can be broken in the most ordinary places, and that the smallest piece of evidence, something invisible, something overlooked, can one day speak louder than silence. The woods where Emily had been found eventually returned to stillness. Leaves fell.
Seasons changed.
Wind moved through the branches just as it had the night Mercer carried her there. But the truth no longer slept beneath the forest floor. It had finally surfaced. And the mystery that once gripped Ashford for 23 long years had come to an end. Not with a sudden revelation or a dramatic chase, but with a confession. A quiet voice inside an interrogation room, and the long-awaited answer to the question that had echoed through the town since 1999. What really happened to Emily Carter? Now, at last, everyone knew. Years passed after the case closed, but the story never completely faded from Ashford. Some crimes leave behind something deeper than headlines. They settle into the bones of a place. They become part of the town's memory, whispered in conversations and retold whenever people gather late at night and the subject drifts toward things that once seemed impossible. Emily Carter's name became one of those memories. New families moved into Ashford who had never heard of the disappearance that once dominated every conversation. Children grew up walking the same streets without knowing why older residents sometimes paused when they passed Maple Street. But for those who had lived through it, the memory never disappeared. They remembered the early days, the missing posters, the search teams spreading through the woods with flashlights, the cold winter mornings when hope slowly turned into uncertainty. And they remembered the long silence that followed. For 23 years, the Carter case existed as a question with no answer. People speculated quietly about what might have happened, but the truth always seemed just out of reach. Until one small piece of evidence, something invisible beneath a victim's fingernails, finally reopened the door. The science that solved the case became part of the story, too. In the late 1990s, DNA testing was still developing. The sample investigators recovered from Emily Carter's fingernails had been too weak to identify a suspect clearly. Back then, the technology simply wasn't powerful enough. But time changed that. By the 2010s, forensic science had advanced dramatically. Laboratories could now rebuild genetic profiles from tiny fragments of biological material once considered useless. Old evidence suddenly became new again. Across the country, long-forgotten cases began reopening. Crimes from the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s, cases investigators once believed would remain mysteries forever, started collapsing under the weight of new forensic tools. Emily Carter's case became one of them. The tiny DNA sample beneath her fingernails had survived inside an evidence bag for decades, waiting, quietly preserved inside a cold case file, until one day the technology finally caught up to the truth. That discovery alone changed the way detectives in Ashford viewed unsolved crimes. Evidence, once considered insignificant, was suddenly re-examined. Old files were reopened. Because if Emily Carter's case could be solved after 23 years, perhaps others could too. Detective Laura Briggs often thought about that moment when a lab called with the DNA match. The moment when a quiet suspicion finally transformed into certainty. She had worked dozens of cases during her career, but none carried the same strange weight as the Carter investigation. Cold cases are different. They stretch across time. They involve detectives who retire before answers arrive, families who grow older while waiting for news, communities that slowly adapt to living with uncertainty. And when a cold case finally breaks open, it feels less like solving a crime and more like finishing a story that began years earlier. For the Carter family, the years following Mercer's conviction were quieter. Emily's grave now sat in a small cemetery outside Ashford, surrounded by trees that changed colors every autumn. Her sister visited often. Sometimes she brought flowers. Sometimes she simply sat on the bench nearby, remembering the life Emily had lived before that November night changed everything. Closure, people often say, arrives when the truth is known. But closure rarely feels like a single moment. It's something that grows slowly over time. A quiet acceptance. The understanding that the story has finally reached its end. In Ashford, people sometimes still talk about the strange way the mystery unraveled. How Mercer had managed to live unnoticed for so long. How he had worked at the same repair shop, spoken politely to customers, and passed neighbors on the sidewalk while carrying a secret capable of destroying an entire town's sense of safety. And perhaps the most chilling detail of all, the one people mention most often, was the way Mercer had once joined the early search efforts. For a short time after Emily disappeared, he had walked through fields alongside volunteers, pretending to look for the woman he had already buried. No one noticed. No one suspected. The killer stood among them, hidden by the simple fact that no one imagined someone so ordinary could be responsible. That realization left a permanent mark on Ashford, because it reminded everyone of a difficult truth. Danger does not always look dangerous. Sometimes it looks like a quiet mechanic who lives down the street. Sometimes it looks like someone you once trusted. The woods where Emily Carter had been found eventually returned to their normal silence. Rain softened the soil again. Leaves covered the ground each autumn. Animals moved through the trees without any sign that the forest had once hidden a secret grave. Nature has a way of reclaiming everything. But the story beneath those trees would never fully disappear. Because in the end, the Carter case was never just about one terrible night. It was about time, about patience, about the slow persistence of investigators who refused to let a file gather dust forever, and about the strange power of evidence, tiny, silent, invisible, that waited years to finally speak. The open door on Maple Street had once been the beginning of a mystery. Now it was simply a memory, a moment frozen in time. The night when Emily Carter's life ended, and the night when a secret began its long journey toward the truth that would eventually bring it into the light. Even after the case closed, People in Ashford sometimes found themselves replaying the story in their minds, trying to understand how something so violent could have unfolded in a place that had always felt so safe. Small towns carry a certain illusion. Neighbors recognize one another's faces. People wave while passing on quiet streets. Children ride their bikes without their parents worrying too much about where they've gone. For years, Ashford had lived inside that illusion. The disappearance of Emily Carter shattered it. And the confession that followed decades later forced everyone to confront a difficult truth. Evil does not always arrive from the outside. Sometimes it grows quietly within the familiar. Sometimes it sits across from you at a kitchen table, smiling politely, hiding behind the mask of ordinary life. Daniel Mercer had been that mask. For 23 years, he blended perfectly into the background of the town. The mechanic who fixed engines. The quiet man who bought coffee every morning. The neighbor who nodded politely while walking past. Nothing about him ever screamed danger. And yet, hidden beneath that calm surface, he carried the memory of a single moment when anger turned deadly. That contradiction fascinated many of the investigators who later studied the case. How could someone commit such a violent act and then simply return to normal life? The answer, psychologists often say, lies in the human mind's ability to compartmentalize guilt. Mercer built a life around the silence. He worked. He paid his bills. He watched the seasons pass. And every day he woke up knowing that the truth remained buried in a shallow grave beneath the forest floor. But time is rarely kind to secrets. The Carter case became one of many examples cited by forensic experts as proof that cold cases are never truly finished. Evidence does not expire. DNA does not forget. Even the smallest trace, skin cells caught beneath a victim's fingernails, can survive decades if preserved properly. In fact, the technology that finally solved the Carter case did not even exist when the crime first occurred. Back in 1999, forensic analysts could only produce partial DNA profiles from the material recovered in Emily's home. The sample was too degraded to identify a specific person. But science continued moving forward. Year after year, new techniques allowed labs to reconstruct genetic patterns from smaller and smaller fragments. What once seemed impossible slowly became routine. And that quiet progress eventually reached the Carter files sitting inside the Ashford Police Department. Detective Laura Briggs sometimes reflected on the strange chain of events that led to the breakthrough. If the evidence technicians in 1999 had not carefully collected the material beneath Emily's fingernails, if the department had not preserved the sample correctly, if forensic technology had advanced a little more slowly, the case might still be unsolved today. Daniel Mercer might still be working quietly at the same repair shop, living out the rest of his life in silence. Instead, the truth surfaced. And once it appeared, it unraveled everything. Across Ohio, other police departments began revisiting their own cold cases with renewed determination. Investigators reopened files that had been dormant for decades. Evidence was sent back to laboratories. Because if one forgotten sample could solve a 23-year-old murder in Ashford, perhaps other mysteries were waiting for the same breakthrough. The Carter case became part of a larger pattern. A reminder that time doesn't always erase crimes. It sometimes strengthens the tools needed to solve them. For the people of Ashford, however, the story remained deeply personal. It wasn't just another cold case, solved through technology. It was the story of someone they had known. Someone who had lived among them. Someone who once taught their children inside a classroom filled with drawings, books, and the quiet optimism that comes with teaching young minds. Emily Carter had not been a distant headline. She had been a neighbor, a teacher, a sister. And for 23 years, her absence had left a space in the town's memory that no one quite knew how to fill. Now, at least, that space contained the truth. The mystery had been replaced with answers. Not comforting answers. Not easy ones. But answers nonetheless. On certain evenings, when the sky above Ashford turns dark and the streetlights begin glowing along Maple Street, older residents sometimes pause while walking past the Carter house. The home looks ordinary now. Fresh paint. Different furniture inside. A family living a life completely separate from the tragedy that once unfolded there. But beneath the quiet surface of the street, the memory remains. The open door, the overturned chair, the smear of blood on the carpet. The night when a simple knock on the door changed everything. And somewhere far from Ashford, inside a prison cell where time moves slowly and silently, Daniel Mercer continues living with the weight of what he did. The anger that drove him into Emily Carter's house lasted only minutes. The consequences will last the rest of his life. That is often the final lesson of stories like this. Violence may happen in a single moment, but the echoes of that moment can stretch across decades, across families, across entire communities. And sometimes, the only thing capable of ending those echoes is the quiet persistence of truth. The truth that waited patiently inside a sealed evidence bag. The truth that science eventually uncovered. The truth that finally answered the question Ashford had been asking since 1999. What really happened to Emily Carter? Now the town knows. And the mystery that once defined Ashford exists only as a memory. A long, haunting chapter that finally reached its end. The story of Emily Carter eventually moved beyond Ashford. Not in a loud, sensational way that many crimes do, but quietly, through investigative reports, forensic conferences, and the slow circulation of cold case studies shared between police departments across the country. Because the Carter case carried something investigators understood very well. It was proof. Proof that time does not always defeat justice. Proof that patience, evidence, and evolving science can reach backward through decades and uncover the truth hiding in places once thought silent. For the detectives who worked the case, that lesson mattered. Cold cases are often described as forgotten files, but the reality is different. Every one of those folders represents a moment frozen in time, a victim whose story stopped mid-sentence, waiting for someone to finish it. The Carter file had waited 23 years. Inside it were the same photographs that had haunted investigators since the first night. The overturned chair, the shattered glass, the smear of blood across the carpet where a quiet evening turned into violence. Those images had not changed, but the world around them had. The science had changed. The tools had improved. And eventually the truth had been forced out of hiding. In many ways, the most chilling part of the case was not the crime itself. It was the years that followed. Daniel Mercer had returned home that night after leaving Emily Carter's body in the woods. He had cleaned the knife, put it away in a toolbox, gone to sleep. The next morning, the town woke up to confusion and fear while Mercer woke up to the same ordinary life he had always known. That contrast stayed with many people in Ashford, because it showed how easily evil can hide inside normal routines. Mercer continued living among them for more than 2 decades. He watched the town search for answers. He listened as neighbors wondered what happened. He even participated briefly in the early efforts to find Emily. And all the while, he knew exactly where she lay. Beneath leaves and branches in a quiet stretch of forest. That secret might have stayed buried forever. But Mercer made one small mistake many years later. One careless moment outside a diner when he threw away a coffee cup. From that single piece of trash, investigators recovered the DNA that linked him directly to the evidence beneath Emily Carter's fingernails. It was a detail almost absurd in its simplicity. The entire mystery that consumed a town for 23 years collapsed because of something as ordinary as a discarded cup. But in the world of forensic investigation, that is often how the truth works. Not through dramatic confessions or sudden revelations. Through fragments. Tiny pieces of biological evidence quietly waiting to be noticed. For Detective Laura Briggs, closing the Carter case remained one of the most powerful moments of her career. She often described the feeling as less like solving a puzzle and more like completing a long, unfinished sentence. The beginning of the story had been written in 1999. The ending simply took decades to arrive. And when it finally did, it carried the weight of every unanswered question that had lingered in Ashford for years. The Carter family eventually returned to something resembling peace. Not because the pain disappeared, but because the uncertainty finally did. The worst part of a disappearance is often the not knowing, the endless questions, the quiet fear that the truth might never appear. Now they knew. Emily Carter's life had been taken during a moment of anger, a brief eruption of violence that destroyed two futures in the same instant, hers and the man who chose to end it. The difference was that Mercer had been allowed 23 years of freedom before the truth reached him. Emily never received that time. In Ashford, the streets remain quiet. Maple Street looks exactly the way it did on that November morning long ago, when the newspaper carrier noticed the open door and the porch light still burning. People still pass by the house without realizing how close they are to the beginning of a mystery that once gripped the entire town. But for those who remember, the story has never really vanished. It lives in memory, in the knowledge that justice, even when delayed, can still arrive, and in the understanding that somewhere, inside thousands of police departments across the country, other cold case files sit quietly on shelves waiting for their moment. Waiting for the right piece of evidence, waiting for the right technology, waiting for the day when silence finally breaks. Because the story of Emily Carter proved something investigators have always believed deep down. A crime may hide for years. It may bury itself beneath time, distance, and forgotten evidence. But the truth has a strange way of surviving. Sometimes it waits patiently inside a single strand of DNA. Sometimes it hides in a forgotten file. And sometimes, after decades of silence, it returns in the form of a quiet confession that finally answers the question everyone has been asking.
What really happened that night?
In Ashford, that question no longer echoes through the town. The mystery is gone. The cold case is closed. And the story, long, haunting, and unforgettable, has finally reached its end.